We will now make the case against the documentary hypothesis. General observation. The kind of scissors and paste editing that Wellhausen assumed is unparalleled in literary history and is intrinsically unlikely. It also has unrealistic assumptions about how consistent writers have to be. The documentary hypothesis assumes that a writer never makes a statement twice over, never allows himself a digression, always sticks to the point, never makes a statement that's difficult to reconcile with something else he said, even in the smallest matter. Well, this is simply untrue of all writers of literature, ancient and modern. My teacher Hanan Brichto used to say that the documentary hypothesis, he was a Jewish scholar at Hebrew Union College where I did my doctoral work. He said that the documentary hypothesis assumes that the editors were idiots. These editors, redactor JE, redactor D, redactor P, are said to have done nothing to fix the contradictions. Well, an editor that doesn't fix contradictions is simply a bad editor. Wellhausen assumes that J and E and P were completely self-consistent before being combined with the other sources, but they were put so in a way, they were combined by a mindless editor that didn't try to harmonize it all. Whybray puts it this way. Whybray is interesting because he's a liberal, but he rejects the documentary hypothesis. Thus, the hypothesis can only be maintained on the assumption that while consistency was the hallmark of the various documents, inconsistency was the hallmark of the redactors. This kind of editing, this scissors and paste type editing, is unparalleled. No ancient literary work is known to have evolved the way Wellhausen thinks that the Pentateuch grew. Some have pointed to Tatian's Diatessaron, a harmony of the four Gospels in the 2nd century, but that's not a particularly good analogy. One is centuries after the Pentateuch. It's in Greek culture rather than Semitic, and it was taking texts that were already canonized and combining them, whereas J and E and D presumably had not been canonized at that point. The Temple Scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls has similar inconsistencies to the Pentateuch, though most Dead Sea Scroll scholars think that it's a work of a single author. The unity of theme, moreover, around the promise to the Patriarchs suggests that mindless editing did not in fact take place. The promise to Abraham of land and seed and blessing is one of the unifying themes of the Pentateuch, but it crisscrosses across Wellhausian source divisions. Hence, the editors seem to be something other than scissors and paste collectors of material, but they're acting more like authors. Now I turn to testing the pillars of the documentary hypothesis. And we're going to argue that each of the pillars is unsound upon testing. Begin with the first pillar, the divine names. Why do some passages in Genesis use Yahweh and others use Elohim? Cassuto gives an answer that does not involve sources. The names are not interchangeable, but certain contexts will prefer one designation for deity over the others. Technically speaking, only one of these terms is a name. Yahweh is God's personal name. Elohim is actually a title, which would mean God or deity. But you can choose to use either Yahweh in certain contexts or Elohim in certain other contexts in a way that has nothing to do with sources. How is it that Yahweh and Elohim differ? Cassuto puts it this way, that Yahweh is God's personal name. It'll be used when emphasizing God's personal and ethical attributes. It'll be used of God in a context of covenant or personal faith. It'll be used of God when God is dealing personally with people. Personal name, personal context. Elohim, on the other hand, is a more general title for deity. It'll be used when speaking of God as creator and source of life of the whole world. It'll be used when you're referring to God with no special emphasis. It'll refer to God when emphasizing his transcendence, when he seems remote from people. And it'll be the way that non-Israelites are likely to refer to God. If you accept the distinction that Cassuto makes, well, that largely explains the usage. So Genesis 1, you have the 6 days of creation that uses Elohim. Why? Well, it's emphasizing God as transcendent creator of the whole world. In Genesis 2 and 3, it switches to an expression Yahweh Elohim, Lord God. Why? Well, now it's a more personal context, emphasizing God's personal covenant dealings with mankind. Elohim is added because the text wants to make sure that you understand that Yahweh is completely identical with Elohim or God mentioned in chapter 1. Genesis 4, having to do with Cain and Abel, also uses Yahweh because, again, God is dealing personally with people. In Genesis 5, the genealogy of Seth uses Elohim because it emphasizes God as creator of the whole world and is alluding to Genesis 1 in that regard. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the passage about the sons of God and the daughters of man, it will switch back to Yahweh, especially in verse 3 because of God's personal striving with man. Again, it's God in a personal relationship context. The flood account mixes Yahweh and Elohim. In certain contexts, they can be used interchangeably. In Genesis 9, 20 through 27, it uses Yahweh with Shem, but Elohim with Japheth. Why? Because out of Shem comes Israel, the people that God establishes a personal covenant relationship with. Whereas out of Japheth will come the nations, various other nations, and hence God to him is the more distant deity. Now this is all based on Cassuto. Whybray refines what Cassuto has said a bit, and I accept his refinement of it. Usage has a combination of theological, stylistic, and unconscious bases. Theologically, there may be a distinction between Yahweh and Elohim. They're not interchangeable terms. They don't mean quite the same thing. Stylistically, certain synonyms simply are not used interchangeably. In English, you can say your coffee is too strong, but no one would ever say your coffee is too powerful, even though powerful and strong can in certain contexts be synonyms. And it may be difficult to understand why a word is or is not used in a particular context. Even professors like me will refer to God sometimes as Yahweh or sometimes as Lord or sometimes as God, and if you ask me, I probably couldn't tell you exactly why I've switched from one to the other. Now what about Exodus 6, 2 through 4? Did the patriarchs know the name Yahweh? A teacher of mine, Gleason Archer, argued yes. They knew the name, but they didn't know its significance. I prefer, however, the view of Gordon Wenham, who said, well, no, the name Yahweh was introduced by the narrator, that is, we could say Moses. And it was a way of showing that the God of the Patriarchs was the same as Yahweh worshipped later by the Israelites. You get a hint of this in Genesis 16:11, where Ishmael means El, or God hears, but the narrator explains that you shall call his name Ishmael because Yahweh has listened to your affliction. So it's introducing the name Yahweh to identify El Shaddai, or the El of the Patriarchs, with Yahweh. We'll continue this in the next video.